Assalamu alaikum. Today we are hosting Professor Jeffrey Kenney from DePaul University, Indiana, the Professor of Islamic Studies. Welcome, Professor Kenney.
Thank you.
We are going to discuss some issues which were discussed at the roundtables where Prof. Kenney took part during the last 2 days. And of course, the first topic will be about Daesh, about the organization of Islamic State. The classical first one and classical question: what went wrong? I'm not a Bernal Lewis to ask that, but right. What are the reasons of a cure? I understand the complexity of the issue, sure. And you already talked about, but was it Sykes-Picot agreement, or was it a problem with Islam, as everybody is talking, or what else? What was the reason of a cure of this group?
Well, I guess in some ways the group has an organizational origin, but you could also say that it has a genealogy, a kind of a deeper history. I think the organizational origin lies in the kind of breakdown of Iraq and the civil war in Iraq, and then the elections and the coming to power of Shia alienating Sunnis, who, even while trying to regain some kind of ground in Iraq, felt somewhat alienated and disenfranchised, having been in power for so long under Saddam Hussein. And you combine the problem of the Sunnis in Iraq with the Arab uprising that led to a civil war in Syria, which itself wound up dividing up into areas of what you could call Shia rule-dominated area with the government, and then the Sunnis, and you had this kind of perfect storm of Sunni disenfranchisement and anger that Al-Qaeda and some of the other groups played into, and ISIS was the Islamic State of Iraq initially, and then ISIS and then IS wound up being able to capitalize on this and use a kind of pro-Sunni, anti-Shia rhetoric and discourse to unite people and to draw in jihadis from a variety of areas that create a kind of civil war and the opportunity to start at least a rump state of some kind. Whether this goes really back to Sykes-Picot, I think that's part of the rhetoric of ISIS, in that it wants to say that the modern nation states as they were created in the Middle East have no validity. But the basis for this is a kind of notion of a return to a caliphate that itself has some questionable validity, at least in the modern context. It might resonate with many Muslims in terms of an ideal, but the reality of how you go about recreating this given the current world of nation states is not clear at all. So, there are a number of immediate factors. I think one of the deeper reasons behind all of this is that in many Muslim societies, you have this ongoing Islamist faction, in some cases moderate, in some cases militant, that has been pushing for an Islamic State since the early part of the 20th century. And this is these organizations, these movements have been in the background of many nation-state politics. In some cases, they've been oppressed. They were oppressed in Syria. They were also oppressed in Iraq. They've been oppressed also in Egypt. And there is still this notion that somehow you can create a modern state rooted in Islam, even if you don't call it a caliphate, that somehow Islam has the answers to political modernity, economic modernity, and while I don't see this really being addressed in the Islamic State currently, I think it does feed into a longer-term narrative that there is some underlying discontent with the way modernity, political modernity has turned out, and that the Muslim world seems somewhat divided about whether it's really Western or whether it's in line with Islam.
So what is the role of Islam in all this, you think? Because some people suggest that it is Islam to blame for what's happening now with the Islamic State.
Well, I'm not, I don't think there's really much having to do with religion other than religion as a kind of discourse and religion as a kind of language of protest. As far as what this has to do with matters of faith, other than the fact that ISIS alienates other Muslims and is judging other Muslims as being inadequate, I think this has to do more with a discontent over politics, economic disenfranchisement, and the willingness of some people to, this gets into a lot of complex issues in terms of what's happening locally in the Middle East versus why a Muslim in Europe or why a Muslim in America would in some way be motivated to leave their homes and join this group. And I think that's completely disconnected from the politics of the Middle East itself. I think because of the media and the ability of ISIS, which is vast, it seems, and they're quite capable of sending out their propaganda, that you have a number of people who are being in some way turned on by this, and they're willing to give up their own lives, at least their way of life, to join this group, not even knowing in many cases what they're getting into, certainly not buying into an ideology as much as just a general discontent. And I think that's the dangerous part of this, is that it's grown into kind of a global issue of why so many people are willing to join this group when the group seems to be so focused on the end time and death and martyrdom. And it doesn't seem to be really about life, even though they say they want to create an Islamic State. It seems to be more about death. And those are the kind of the two extremes of the group that for some odd reason seem to have a broader appeal than what many people would like.
So if we try to engage into intellectual exercise suggested to us by Graham Fuller, if we just suppose that Islam wasn't there, can we say that the same thing could have happened just under another pretext? How do you think?
Well, that's a difficult thing to do. Let's see, if Islam weren't there, well, I guess that means so what would still be in place would be authoritarian politics, perhaps. So that wouldn't be removed because one doesn't need to be, Islam doesn't need to be in place to have authoritarian politics. You don't need to have Islam in place for states to fail, which clearly Syria, Iraq are now failing states in some way. I think clearly you would not have something like the Islamic State if you didn't have the fact that the people are Muslim. And so Islam in that sense acts as a flag, it acts as an appeal, but it's more symbolic politics, I think, than really a politics about faith. And in that sense, I guess you really cannot remove Islam from it. So I think that is a nice thought game. But in some ways, I don't think it quite works because people, when they're dealing with politics, they deal with values and they deal with ideas, not just with the tangibles of everyday decision making, and that often means symbolism. And Islam provides a lot of the symbolic backdrop to the way Muslims in that region talk about politics, talks about what's important to them.
So those people there in the Islamic State, they're so successfully manipulating with the Islamic symbolism, Islamic text, and even as Graham Woods suggested in his prominent article in The Atlantic, that these people are really real Muslims and they are following the real Islam. And it would be a mistake to think that they don't and to call them kafirs or apostates or whatever. So is there any problem with the Islamic text that could be so easily manipulated and used in favor of such demonic ideas?
Well, look, I'm not going to do a Quranic critique here or a critique of the Sunnah. Clearly, there are elements of both that body of literature that people can draw upon to motivate violence. There is talk of jihad. There is usually that jihad is in a particular context, a Quranic context, but obviously people lift these things out of context and apply them in modern periods for different reasons. But this is a selection process. Muslims who are trying to envision themselves or imagine themselves in the modern world make decisions about which text they're going to draw upon. And clearly there are some people who are, one could argue, motivated to violence and motivated to militant change, and they can draw on those texts. One could just as easily say, for example, draw on revolutionary Marxist texts that would legitimize change also. But of course that wouldn't have the same resonance in the Muslim world. It might have resonance elsewhere. One could also draw on anarchist thinking to kind of motivate people. Again, it doesn't have the kind of symbolic capital and the symbolic discourse that it would have in the Muslim world. But I don't think that there's, you cannot change sacred texts. Sacred texts are sacred for the way people view them. They're there for a reason, and you just don't go, you can't change them, but you can change the way you interpret them and the way you understand them. So what we're dealing with here is not just some kind of blind, here is a text and this is what it always means. We're talking about people who have given certain kinds of meanings to text, and they are getting people to agree with them. And the real challenge is, of course, for other Muslims in other places, and they have done this, is to renounce this and to say, this is not how I understand the text. The text might talk about jihad, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to do the same kind of things that ISIS is doing.
You said very good thing in your book that the past doesn't come to the present unmediated.
Right.
It necessarily needs a mediator. So who do you think were drivers behind this IS movement? Because as we spoke the last 2 days, that many people behind such movements, they were actually secular. Like if we take Zionism, for example,
Sure.
its leaders
Sure.
were pretty secular. So in this case, you think the drivers of this movement are of this same kind, driven by the other reasons other than religious, or the religion reasons stand first?
Well, I think again, if I went back to what I had mentioned before, obviously Islamism as an ideology, as a way of Muslims living in the modern world and taking it on their own terms instead of borrowing from Western ideology or Western nationalism, what they consider to be Western nationalism. I don't consider it Western, but this is part of the debate, is whether is nationalism Western? Is capitalism Western? Or are these really kind of universal phenomenon? But even casting it as nationalism as being foreign to Islam was one of the arguments in early Islamism. Hassan al-Banna made the case that nationalism is foreign because it's dividing up Muslims against Muslims, and anything that does that is a problem. So I think there is an underlying rhetoric and discourse about Islam and Muslim peoples being somehow different from other modern peoples, and that they need to have a kind of system of being that is rooted in Islam. I don't think that I think that's an interpretive move of how to be modern and Muslim, but I don't think that is the only interpretive move. But that as a kind of an underlying set of ideas have allowed all kinds of ways of implementing that through a democratic process, perhaps, which is what happened with the Muslim Brothers post Arab Spring.
But it didn't end up well.
It didn't work, obviously. But it didn't work in part because of authoritarian rule. I don't think you can blame that on Islam, even though in some cases the authoritarians use Islam for their own legitimacy. I think this is part of it, is that the Muslim world, especially in the Middle East right now, there's such a thick coating of Muslim discourse, of Muslim politics on everything, that you can scrape it off and you can see some root causes. Power is often at the bottom of it. But still, people use this kind of language, and it kind of feeds into it. And both secularists in the Muslim world have done this too. They've tried to co-opt Islam for their own purposes. So I think this is something that Muslims themselves are going to have to sort out as they sort out their own politics, is that do we really need to rely as much on Islam to facilitate our interaction with modernity, with the economy, with society, especially in societies that are more multicultural, pluralistic, where Muslims represent perhaps the majority, but you have important minority groups that also want to be part of the society, want to feel like they're full citizens, but may be alienated because of the way the majority Muslim population talks about politics, and in the process perhaps alienates others.
So if to go back to the question that who to blame for what's happening, what do you think the role of the West, and in particular the United States, in all of this? Because some conspiracy theories, and we must address them, suggest that it was wholly orchestrated by the West.
Well, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to believe that the West has a certain amount of responsibility. Western foreign policy in the region has certainly not created the kind of openings and the kind of positive results that I think motivated Western leaders to intervene in many of these countries. That said, I wish the U.S. and the Western powers in general were as able to orchestrate things as many people who criticize them say they are. They're just not able to control events, and I think that's the reality on the ground. They would like to try to control events, but you can't control events, especially you can't control events simply by military intervention. That's not going to change the way people think. You can force people, you can defeat an enemy perhaps, but it's hard to defeat an idea that way. And so the U.S. has been quite proficient at using its military technology to go after identified enemies, but that doesn't mean you have the ability to recreate those societies. These societies have to create themselves. They have to build upon their own heritage, and they don't want to, they shouldn't be answerable to the West for this. So I do not think that the U.S. there's some kind of conspiracy where there's a group of leaders who are, in fact, giving IS its orders, and it's really following that out. I think it's, that's clear, to me, that's clearly not happening. But this is one of those things that how can you can't really disprove conspiracies like this because the whole point is that they're secret and no one knows who's doing what. So it's one of these things, it's a self-fulfilling thing. If you believe there's a conspiracy there, then there must be a conspiracy. Again, if people were able to control, I can't imagine that someone who was able to control events and control the way people were going to behave could have ever predicted the mess that is right now the Middle East. I mean, and I think for those people who see the Middle East and say what's really happening now is that Muslims and Middle Easterners have weakened, I think that's true. But to blame that on a conspiracy, I think there's just too many other factors. And Middle Easterners are involved with this, Arabs are involved with this, of creating their own reality that has partially led to the collapse and the failure of so many of these states, and the civil wars and the sectarianism. I don't think the United States invented the Sunni-Shia divide, right? I think so you can only blame so much of this on the U.S. I wish the U.S. would take responsibility for some of its policy failures, but for a conspiracy, I don't buy that one.
Probably didn't invent, but maybe invested some oil into the fire.
Well, I think that there's definitely some economic interests here, right? Which is what foreign policy, one could argue, is about, is trying to use one's power and influence to help one's own country and to keep one's own prices down. Now, how one goes about this, and at the expense of which other people, that's a problem, and it's a problem of values, and it's a moral problem. But unfortunately, I think like many people in many places, Americans are interested in lower gas prices, and do they really care how those prices are lowered? I think if you ask them that kind of question, they would say yes, but they're really more interested in the lower prices. And to the extent that politicians can facilitate that, do we need to go to war for this? Actually, I don't think so. But there's a lot of people who are pressuring for this, that we shouldn't be going to war in order to lower gas prices, in order to ensure the flow of oil. We should come up with alternative energy for this kind of thing. But this has a completely different politics in the U.S. too. I mean, now we're saying we don't want to go to the war in the U.S., so we should allow fracking, allow a certain kind of practice of extracting things from the ground that some people think is doing environmental damage. So people are using kind of the problems of the Middle East to say, oh, we can extract from the ground here. And this is a business argument, right? This is a corporation making an argument that really has nothing to do with world politics, but it has to do with how you use the discourse of this stuff.
So everybody is using something for his own purposes.
I think there's the politics of everything.
So shifting to the topic you discussed today at the roundtable arranged by the Islamic Renaissance Front and Penang Institute and University of Nottingham on the future of religious freedom, and of course with particular link to Malaysia. You were talking about the necessity to arrange a real value-based dialogue and to restrict people from to avoid transforming the everyday decision-making process into the holier-than-thou race.
Right.
So how can they do that? What instruments we can use to restrict this kind of side effects of penetration of religion into politics, into public life?
Well, look, I don't think you can prevent individuals from trying to make value judgments and promote value judgments based on what they hold to be important. And I think many people of faith draw on those things. When you live in a multicultural society, should Hindus in this country, should Buddhists in this country, should Christians in this country have to express their own values and their own will through their own religious culture? Or would that not even be heard? Would that be considered a non-starter? I think it's the case that most minority groups often talk in more secular terms about issues because they see themselves as minorities. And it's the majority that feels empowered to use its own cultural discourse to speak about issues. So in some ways, it's up to the majority to, I guess you could say, police itself, to at least allow discussions to take place about very important issues that all citizens share, right? So this is not just exclusive to the Muslims in this country, but all citizens would share, that allows people to participate in a conversation where they don't have to, you don't want to have a non-Muslim have to adopt Muslim speak in order to be heard, right? They shouldn't need to do that. So at some level, people need to be able to talk about important issues that all citizens share together, and that means avoiding the kind of language that would empower one group over another, right? How that happens, how one goes about that, is not easy to do, especially when religion has become so highly politicized. And we have parties in Malaysia that are defining themselves in religious terms. So when you have this kind of competition of a ratcheting up of Islam and Islamization, it becomes very difficult for, I think, non-Muslim groups, for minority groups, to get their voices heard and to be seen, not just heard, but seen as legitimate. So I think that's a problem. And the only way to do that is for people to continue to make claims as citizens, use the documents of the country, the constitutions and other, and to interpret it in ways that opens up the society instead of closes it up.
How about introducing into discourse another counter-narratives from the past? Like here we like to talk about the society that Prophet established in Medina and the good example of that, or bringing something from Hadith to enrich the discourse with the positive examples.
Right. Certainly I think that's viable, and Muslims can do that and do that. So there are, I guess, what you could call liberal, progressive Muslims who can interpret the Islamic tradition in a way that would open up society and the possibility for others to participate fully. But actually what's happening by one could argue that what they're doing is reinforcing the importance of the tradition, which really continues to be an insider argument among Muslims of how the tradition is going to be understood, and that leaves outsiders being outsiders, right? And that becomes what, an internal Muslim argument about who's being a good Muslim and who's interpreting the text correctly. And in that entire process, again, you have these practical issues of everyday life and politics not being addressed because Muslims are too busy arguing among themselves about how do I understand the Quran in this sense, how do I understand the Sunnah in this sense. That is not being very it's not really focused on the issues at hand that would relate to a significant portion of the Malaysian population that doesn't, that are made up of minority groups.
Probably we also need some institutional limitations, like the Dipender Harshadrai just mentioned today that we just need to curtail the funding and to work through some institutional means, not just through the discourse, which until now didn't make any big sense.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously there has in Malaysia been a number of governmental offices and institutions created with the Islamic reform that occurred here. And this winds up, you know, putting a kind of face on the government that is strengthening a particular group of people, the Malays, often at what some people would consider to be the expense of minority groups and larger issue of what it means to be a Malaysian, not just what it means to be a Malay. And this is a problem. I mean, I think this would be a definite problem looked at from the outside by anyone who wants to say that there is religious freedom and that everyone is considered to be equal. It shouldn't matter necessarily what one's religiosity is. If you're a citizen, you're a citizen, and you should be a full-fledged citizen, and you shouldn't have to think that you're a second-class citizen because you can't participate in the kind of Islamic discourse that's often used by the dominant parties and by the government offices.
My last question was about the Islamist parties who make their raison d'être to establish the establishment of the Islamic State or introduction of hudud, which they think is going to, they are implementing the God's law and the God's order. My question was that, is it really necessary to implement Sharia into the legal system of the country to lead an Islamic way of life and to be, in fact, an Islamic state? In fact, not by name and not by label attached to it.
Well, in some ways, that's a question that you could ask fellow Muslims. Right, I'm not a Muslim, so it's not. I can't speak for those people who feel that they could only be fully Muslim in an Islamic state that enforces Islamic law. If that is the case, then there's lots of Muslims living in Muslim majority societies that are not living fully Muslim lives according to their own understanding. And this is, by the way, this goes back to my point about the way Islamism has kind of defined what it means to be a modern Muslim, which is this system that needs to be undergirded by Islamic law in its fullest application, and that if you're not living in these kind of societies, you're essentially living like a quote-unquote Westerner under secular laws. If you buy into that, then clearly you can't be a good Muslim unless you are living according to Islamic law. So you're going to lead some kind of thwarted Muslim life. I think one could say, and you'd have to ask, again, I feel uncomfortable, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of Muslims, say, living in the West, but who feel that they are living very positive Muslim lives in non-Muslim majority countries. Do they need the Sharia? I mean, do I need an artificial structure that is forcing me to do what I wouldn't otherwise do? Some people
closing the door of hell for you.
Well, some people believe that without the structure, without the compulsion, that they're not going to be able to lead those lives. Well, I mean, that's one way to view it. Or if Islam and Muslims aren't dominating the society, then it's not really a Muslim society. That's a very problematic perspective from my perspective, living in a country that is very pluralistic, and you have lots of different ethnic, religious groups in it. To create that kind of image of Islam and what it means to be a Muslim is to shape other people's lives in ways that you might say that you're not trying to shape it, but clearly you are. Because if you're in the majority and you're demanding that others either, if not abide by, see themselves as different kinds of citizens with different kinds of laws, that's a recipe for a problem. Everyone needs to be equal under the law, and if you have one set of laws for one set of people, another set of laws for another, there's no equality there.
Thank you so much, Professor Kenney.
Thank you.